Welcome to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast. Each week we'll be joined by educational experts from across the globe who are going to offer insights, inspiration and guidance to help practitioners unlock potential for learning in the early years. Today's episode carries a trigger warning for a brief mention of neglect in the second half of the episode. If you're concerned or upset by anything mentioned, please reach out to your safeguarding lead or someone else for support. Hello, my name is Alistair Bryce-Clegg and I'm your host for this week's TTS Talking Early Years podcast. I am an early years author and consultant. Now, through this series, we're going to be discussing the importance of nurturing social and emotional well-being in the early years, which is really important. And we're going to be inspiring you with some guidance and resources that will really help you in that practice. So today I am delighted to introduce to you Anne-Marie Christian as today's guest. Hi, Anne-Marie, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you. How are you, Alistair?
All good and excited to be back on the TTS podcast talking all things early years. So for any of our listeners that haven't come across you, can you just give us a bit of background into who you are and what you do?
Thank you. So I am a social worker by trade, in the sense of a qualified social worker of 27 years. And I was a manager for 15 years. So I now am independent international safeguarding consultant. And I deliver training, consultancy, I write articles, I do public speaking, and I do a lot around the whole thing around safeguarding. So for 0 to 5 in early years, I managed a child protection team from 0 to 5 for the local authority. So today I'll be sharing quite a lot of knowledge from that role I did in understanding what does safeguarding look like for, obviously, that age group. Also, I've worked a lot with early years settings, from the childminders to the maintained nurseries to the private nurseries. And also I do a lot of international work too. So I'm familiar with that model in various other countries as well. So I'm really looking forward to speaking to you today, Alistair.
Yeah, so basically what you've said is we could talk for the next 6 hours and still have loads more to talk about when it comes to safeguarding. So Anne-Marie, you've got a wealth of information that you're going to be able to share, which is great. But for this first episode, I think it's really important that we try and define what we mean by the term safeguarding, because especially the fact that it's linked to lots of kind of Ofsted commentary and people get really frightened about the fact that, you can fail your Ofsted because of just this word safeguarding. If we could unpick it, I think that would really help.
So safeguarding in the sense of in early years would be obviously preventing a child being subject to harm. So having things around that can ensure that we prevent it from happening. So free from harm, I say, and also harm being ill treatment, maltreatment, physical, emotional, neglect and sexual. So we're talking about a child. And when we talk about 0 to 5, we're also talking about unborn child, i.e., parent with child who obviously would be, there's concerns there if that unborn child is in an environment where they're not safe. So again, we've had cases of children on the child protection plan in social care terms at risk of concern or abuse in, unborn babies. So we'll talk a lot about that today. But the definition is definitely, we know from UNICEF Rights of the Child that there's a big kind of world united kind of, program around understanding the rights of the child, and the child's got a right to be protected and kept safe. And that means well-being as well. It means physical. It means, all those things where a child's welfare is also kept safe.
And so obviously we're talking about a variety of settings where children may be. And again, if you're talking about the unborn child, also our responsibility to parents that we're working with and parents within the community. But we've got everybody potentially listening, from students through to childminders, through to nursery, then into maintained settings and schools. So how does safeguarding look in those various, or some of those various contexts?
So in my role as a frontline children's services social worker, I was very privileged to see how in different age groups, from 0 to 5, then from primary age, 5 to 11, and then obviously older, how, all this impacts on children. So 0 to 5, we know about brain development, we know about early years experiences, we know about adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. We know about the whole thing about the long-term impact it can have of a child witnessing or being subject to harm in the sense of whether it's domestic or physical, etc. And then we know how it can impact on their then functioning, their social skills, their relationships, their education, chaotic lives where they still can't function and process what they've been through. Also, their emotional intelligence and their outcomes, their confidence, their self esteem, and their identity. So it's really important that we appreciate those little people, 0 to 5, how various things that they're going to be going through, they will not understand at that age. But as they get older, we know through puberty that children have another stage of child development where they reflect on their experiences that they can make sense of now. And that's a common thing where they remember when they were 4, when this happened at home, and now they're understanding it was abusive, etc. So it's really important, going back to your point, that in 0 to 5, we have to appreciate that we have got a few challenges. We'll talk about that later. But it's about what is our role as staff in our duty of care to safeguard children, the policy, the procedures. What am I looking for? Do I trust what the parent's telling me? Something doesn't seem right in this coursework they've done. They've drawn a picture. It looks a bit weird. Are they trying to tell me something?
Yeah, I think you touched on a really important point there, that for early years, we are getting an interpretation of the world through the eyes and often the vocalizations of a child from 0 to 5. So what they perceive to be usual or typical, they often articulate in different ways, but also when they're trying to tell you about a potential experience that they've had, maybe positive or negative, the language that they use isn't always the straightforward language of an adult where they'd say, this happened on this day and then this happened. So a lot of our role as early years practitioners is also about being interpreters. And there's a risk with that as well, that you can over-interpret. So where do you sit? You talked about the fact that, if a child draws a picture, if a child says something, is like, are they indicating something to you? Is that something you need to pick up on? And I suppose the other concern is that you pick up on everything and
Okay.
you sort of make assumptions that aren't accurate. So where would we sit in terms of a good, healthy approach to safeguarding on that?
A good, healthy approach to safeguarding would be the motto that I've always used. And in my career, I've been involved in 2 case reviews where a case that was in a team I was managing, later on something happened where a child unfortunately had a fatality. And every decision I made as a social worker and also manager was think the unthinkable and believe it could happen here. So
Yeah.
therefore, every decision I made, I thought of the worst scenario. So i.e., if I think about the worst, then I'm able to protect that child from the worst and then work forward with what we have. So it's important that, going back to your question, what we're looking out for is professional curiosity, we call it, when we see something and we're questioning it. Therefore, through our training we've had, that's telling us that we need to report it to our safeguarding lead in our setting. Sometimes it could be a change of behaviour, a certain word they've said, quite a mature word they've said, or you're just concerned about the child today based on something that doesn't add up. So the more we are suspicious, because what children rarely do is come in and tell us what's happened. So
Yeah.
we have to pick up the pieces around it. And in all those case reviews we've seen, information sharing is key. So if all staff can understand what their role is to be the eyes and the ears of the setting to ensure that we can create a proactive approach to safeguarding, not a reactive, but creative, proactive, where as I come to work today, I'm very alert to any suspicions or things that I'm seeing, that we need to create the whole picture of a child's life. And the more people in that setting that have concerns about that one child, the safeguarding lead then creates a kind of understanding of what's happening in that child's life. And that's what's really magical about safeguarding, is that the more information that may appear to be low level bits, when we get it together, and I remember as a social work manager, the most pettiest, I remember one, I'll give you a quick example, concerns we had about a child who, emotional abuse and neglect. And again, for our talk today, we are going to have lots of health warnings, because obviously talking about safeguarding is a very distressing subject. So health warning for you listening. If anything is triggering for you, please get support from your,
Absolutely. Yeah.
your own environments, or independently, again, NSPCC helpline. But we are going to be talking about a few emotive subjects today in that. So
Yeah.
in this one, it was neglect, and it was a child where we had concerns, but we need more evidence. And someone on the way home had witnessed a child in the pouring rain outside the car where mother was in the car. So the mother had deliberately punished the child by getting wet. So when we heard, it escalated. So something so petty of a child being left out in the rain while mum was in the car was definitely something that when we heard it helped us to escalate it to a safeguarding concern of a child protection investigation. So that's an
Yep.
example of something so petty, i.e., on its own, it sounds like, okay, well, maybe mum was doing something getting out the car, but in what we already had on that family, it was enough to escalate it.
I think you're talking then about the fact that safeguarding in a setting is also responsibility and is carried by the team. So it's not that we're saying to anybody listening it's going to be completely your responsibility. Ultimately, the safeguarding officer will make a decision, but you've got a team that are collaborative and putting together pieces of the jigsaw. I think the other really important bit around that is the training aspect of it, which we'll cover later on. But
Yes,
good training enables a team to make really good informed decisions as opposed to just going with your gut and a little bit worried that you might be saying the wrong thing about. And
absolutely.
I think as humans as well, we don't want to make assumptions about people that might be incorrect. And I know 10 years of my career was spent being a head teacher of a large school in a fairly affluent area, and I dealt with more cases of safeguarding than one more is one you'd like to. And I think one of the things we thought a lot about was the assumptions we made about our parents, both positive and negative. That actually, when it comes to families and children, you can't make any assumptions just because somebody is from a certain group or a certain class that their behavior is going to be in a certain way. Because my school was nice and fairly leafy and what you'd probably call fairly middle class, and there were still significant safeguarding issues that occurred within that school. And
Absolutely.
sometimes they were so bad that you had to make a decision in the moment that what is occurring right now in this moment between this parent and child is a safeguarding concern. But lots of times, like you've described, it was just a number of people saying, this doesn't feel quite right. That I wasn't quite sure about that. They've said this, and you begin to put together those pieces. And again, it's finding that balance between acting quickly to support the child, but also having enough information that you are making an informed decision.
Absolutely. And in the comment you just made, in 2018, Professor Claudia Bernard from Goldsmith University did some fantastic research about affluent neglect. And
Mm,
there's a theory behind it. So like yourself, I've been in scenarios, I've worked for a few boroughs around, royal boroughs as well in various places where people make assumptions that, oh, in this area it'd be less. But if anything, it's just a hidden form of abuse done differently in a
yeah,
sense of because they've got a lovely house, they have money. It doesn't mean that people make assumptions about them more trusting and people
yeah.
who are more kind of, have their au pairs, their nannies, things are being provided for by paid carers. But as you said, it's still there. So you're absolutely right. We need to be mindful of anyone listening today, thinking about what are our personal prejudices, things that we have, our unconscious biases, that we are missing things because we make an assumption about something rather than actually being open-minded and seeing it for any person. So I always say, Alistair, when I work internationally, child abuse does not discriminate.
Mm.
Any religion, any gender, any type of family, rather than the stereotypical that we see a lot in the media. you know. But that's just really important again, that it could be the very religious family, anyone, even leadership, anyone, rather than the stereotypical.
I think so. And also that if we're talking about abuse, physical or mental abuse can happen outside of the immediate nuclear family. So again, I've worked with cases where it's been extended family and the actual initial immediate nuclear family had no knowledge that any kind of
Absolutely.
abuse was taking place. So again, it's about having your eyes and ears open. And really, I think what we're talking about is tuning into the child. And the more you know that child, the more that you can detect, like with your own children,
Yeah.
you know when there's something that's not quite right. And it even just can be a mood. It doesn't necessarily have to be anything they say. But the better you know your children that you're working with, and the more able you are to tune in.
Absolutely. So things like now we're in the summer, right? So you've got summer camps, you've got sports clubs, you've got faith groups, you've got even online. There's so many ways a child could be subject to harm, and families don't. I think they sometimes they believe that this setting has had checks done, therefore everyone has been, in the UK we call it DBS checks. Overseas there might be police checks, but there's been checks done to, vetting done, so therefore this person's safe. And going back to what you said, we know that a lot of people are not caught. And I get gentle reminders at least every few weeks of another person who's been discovered who's been harming children. So we've got to be mindful exactly around family, friends and relatives, of course, within the community and home, but also, the education establishment, to also any other setting where our child might be, even babysitters, could be anybody. So we just got to be open-minded of who we trust. Potentially could be a person who, could be doing things. So we just got to be really understanding and introduce that concept to parents too, to be more aware of how harm happens, in those opportunities that people have, making it into a game. For a 0 to 5, for example, it could be intimate care, i.e. changing their nappy. It could be, playing that little tickle game. There's lots of ways, taking pictures, and they wouldn't know it's harmful.
And again, we are talking about safeguarding in all of these podcasts that you're guesting on, and we are obviously talking about some of the things that are not pleasant and can be scary. But again, I think just to point out to listeners that what we're trying to do here is identify opportunities from our experience where safeguarding has come up and define what it is. It doesn't mean to say that this is happening to everybody every day in the outside world, but it's really important that we need to be very aware of it so that we can notice it when it does happen.
Thank you. The NSPCC say 1 in 20 are harm. So when we think about our groups and numbers, that's what they talk about, especially for sexual harm. That's what they talk about, 1 in 20.
And I think there's lots of nuance to it as well. I remember also dealing with a family whose cultural expectations of children's behaviour were very different from the cultural norm that existed within our school, and their idea of punishment was very physical because they came from a family culture and a wider culture of very physical punishment, and they would publicly display that physical punishment outside of the school with their child. And obviously, for them it was a discussion about the harm that will do to your child, but for them as a family and for their actual beliefs that they weren't doing harm. They believed that, by physically punishing your child, you were teaching them a valuable lesson about how to learn to behave. So sometimes it's way more nuanced, and those things are quite difficult, sometimes difficult conversations to have, difficult things to unpick. But again, there's lots and lots of information out there that can really support you as a practitioner if you come across that sort of instance.
Absolutely. So, exactly. So, for example, smacking, the whole debate about smacking is, like you said, in some cultures, smacking your child is still seen as a show of love, a show of discipline.
Yeah.
Correcting behaviours to make you a better person, for better outcomes. So, absolutely, it's like we need to be mindful of, harmful practices in the sense of there is, and also religion. There's loads of things where we would question it in the sense of impact on the welfare of the child, rather than a person doing it through love,
Yeah, I think in this kind of first episode, what we've kind of unpicked then, Anne-Marie, is that safeguarding is a very complex issue, but there is definitely support and training out there that can help practitioners to be better able and equipped to make good decisions about safeguarding. And in our next episode, where I'm going to be talking to Anne-Marie all about common issues and common challenges that we might have within our settings, and again, what we can do to try and support ourselves and our colleagues and ultimately support children. So for that first episode, it's been fascinating, and time disappeared, honestly, and I can't wait to talk to you again. Thank you very much, Anne-Marie.
Thank you.
And I'd like to say a huge thank you to our guest, Anne-Marie, for joining us and providing such valuable insights. You've been listening to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast with me, Alistair Bryce-Clegg, and Anne-Marie Christian. And if you've been inspired by our conversation today, don't forget you can sign up via the link in our episode notes to be the first to hear about future episodes and access exclusive follow-up content, including ideas for your setting and links to loads of relevant resources.